Well, good morning and welcome back to another wonderful Sunday school session. And thank you so very much to each of you for coming. We definitely appreciate it. And thank you for coming on time. Thank you also for joining me in this great trial experiment of me recording Sunday school sessions beforehand for you all. I definitely appreciate your understanding and your patience as we work out some of the kinks and as we take a look at seeing how we can make this work the best as possible. Received a little bit of feedback from last time. I'm gonna push ahead with what I would really love to do, but then so for example, today we're going to still be looking at the biblical text in hand, but it's going to be quite a bit bigger, and so hopefully it will be more visible to those who are wanting to look at it. And the reason why I would like the biblical text up here is so that I also have something to look at as I'm doing the recording. Just makes it easier for me to point out some different things, and so would like to try to keep that. But if it doesn't work out today, this is the largest setting I have. So if it doesn't work out today, then we're just going to have to go with a picture of me, a giant picture of me, and then maybe some of the atlas photos and things like that as well. So again, thank you so very much, and your continual feedback will just help me to tighten up these recordings and make sure that they're as well as possible. So let's begin, as we would always do with our Sunday school class. Let's begin with prayer, specifically prayer for one another. And so I would just ask that you would share your prayer concerns with each other. And after that, have maybe several people pray for one another. And that way we can begin. Okay, so let's pause the video here and please share your prayer concerns and then pray for one another. All right, thank you so very much for praying for one another. Definitely appreciate that. Now let's get our theological wheels rolling with a reading from the Psalms. So if you all could please turn to Psalm 51, Psalm chapter 51, and why don't we just read the whole thing? Maybe one person could read Psalm 51, verses 1 through 10, and a second person read verses 11 through 19. Thank you so very much. Let's pause the video at this time, and let's have the psalm reading of Psalm 51. Thank you. All right, so for today's session, we turn and we're continuing to look at Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to be on verse 15 to begin, and so that's where we'll begin. If we could please have one person, let's stop the video, let's have one person read for us Daniel chapter 8, verses 15 through 17. And with that, we'll then have a good little section to begin our study. So one person will stop the video, have one person please read Daniel 8, verses 15 through 17. Thank you. And so Daniel is seeking to understand it. There appears before him one like the appearance of a man. And Daniel then hears the man's voice calling between the banks of the Ulai. Okay, so now the question is, where is Ulai? And what can we then identify from it? Well, let's take a look here. I've pulled up the Zondervan Encyclopedia of the Bible. It says Ulai is a stream or artificial irrigation canal near Susa. Okay, so if we're thinking about Susa, then we remember from our map last week, oh yes, this is the capital of the Persian Empire. And so what that means for us then as we flip back over to Daniel is that when Daniel is receiving the explanation for the vision, he's still in the vision. Remember, Daniel's physical body is back in Babylon, and so he's transported in his spirit, he's transported in his mind and his vision to Susa, and he's actually still there. He's seen the ram, he's seen the goat, now he's still there wondering what they mean, and right there in this setting, one having the appearance of a man, it appears, and that man's voice, or a man's voice, calls out between the banks of the Ulai, and it calls out. Notice that the person actually doesn't call out to Daniel, but calls out, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So again, here's just a softball that we don't have to pause the video for. The question is, where have we heard of the name Gabriel in a supernatural context before? And you'd be absolutely right then to think about the birth narratives of Jesus Christ. That's primarily where we see Gabriel coming out. And so Gabriel is an angel, and so Gabriel is the one whom the man calls to, and the man gives Gabriel an order. Make this man understand the vision. There's no question. There's no please. It's a direct command, which helps us to then understand something about this one that has the appearance of a man, that cries out with a man's voice, is that this man has authority over the angels. Specifically has authority over the angels, namely Gabriel, right? And so what might be going on here? Well, again, we can kind of look back and think about the prince of the host that we had talked about in Daniel chapter 8, verse 11, and how that then links back to Joshua. We looked at this in the last video, the last Sunday school class, how that links back to Joshua and the man, the commander of the Lord of the commander of hosts, the commander of the army of the Lord of hosts, I should say. And how that man was that commander. And so we have that same sort of thing, that same sort of link, that quite possibly the one having the appearance of man is actually Jesus. It's the commander of the host. Okay, and he has the appearance of a man. Okay, in that. And so that's sort of some of the identity things there happening. So Gabriel is told to make the man understand. Let's take a look in verse 17. So he came near where I stood. We have a picture up of that, which I showed us a little bit last week. Let's take a look here at the picture. We can, that's about as zoomed in as I'm going to get, but you see this artistic rendering of it. You have Daniel here, kind of bowing low, and then you have the interpreter, who's depicted as Gabriel, with wings here, and giving the interpretation of the vision. Okay, and so that's just an artistic rendering, something just to wrap the mind around. Most likely, again, angels usually don't have wings. That's usually the seraphim. Angels are simply messengers, and there's a variety of contexts in which they don't appear with wings. And so whether or not they have wings, sort of irrelevant, but many artistic renderings you'll see with wings, probably wrong there. But it just, for the artistic rendering, it gives the sense, oh yes, this is an angel, this must then be Daniel, and they're interpreting the vision. Okay, so that's just an artistic rendering there for that. All right, so the Gabriel comes near. Notice here that when Gabriel comes near, it says, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. Right, that posture of falling on one's face is very much a posture of prostrating oneself. It's a posture one might call of weakness, but really also almost a posture of worship. And so the sense is that Daniel is overcome by the appearance of Gabriel coming near to him, right? It gives us a sense of just how incredible the holy is, right? And the angel Gabriel, of course, is someone that belongs to God. He has a measure of holiness, right? A measure of God's presence with him, a measure of being God's creature. And he has such power, he has such presence that Daniel, who is a servant of God, one of the best in the Bible, falls on his face and just remains there. Gabriel says to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." Now, we need to then talk about this picture of Son of Man, or what this language of Son of Man means. It means two different things in Scripture. Sometimes it is a title, and other times it's simply meaning human being. Okay? Where it means title, for example, and this is something we just saw, was actually in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. There came one like a son of man, right? And that becomes a proper title for Jesus Christ, the Son of Man. And actually, it then becomes something that means the opposite in Jesus. It means that this person is actually divine, that they are actually God. And in the context of Daniel 7, we can clearly see that. "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom," and all that sort of stuff. And we've kind of talked all about that in Daniel 7, so I don't want to recap too much. But the idea there is that one of the ways Son of Man functions in the Old Testament is as a title for actually this Savior, this King, this Messiah figure. And the other places, like here in Daniel chapter 8, in verse 17 that we're in, the Son of Man just means that. It means human being. All right, and so Daniel's just a human being. "Understand, O Son of Man, that this vision is for the time of the end." Now, before we go further into this interpretation, what I want us to do is pause the video, and I want us to talk about what we think the time of the end means. So go ahead and take a few minutes, just a few minutes, maybe 2 or 3, 4 comments, something like that, unless you're getting into a good discussion. 2, 3, 4 comments. What does the time of the end mean? Let's pause the video here. All right. Well, thank you so very much for having that discussion. I hope that was helpful. Here's the thing about the time of the end. And so I want to pipe in here with my own thoughts and with some thoughts of the commentaries and tell us a little bit more about what it means here. Joyce Baldwin on page 177 of her commentary says this: "It is not necessarily the end of all things. It's the end of a rebellion because God intervened." So those are her sort of comments. When you see the end in Scripture, it's the end of what? The end of who? From whose point of view? Right, so from us, when we're coming to the Daniel text and we see time of the end, the easiest interpretation for us to think about is the second coming of Jesus Christ, the end of the world. Right, that's kind of where we stand with it. And yet, from Scripture's perspective, sometimes the end can mean that, it can. And other times it means the end of an age, the end of an empire, the end of an epoch. And they just simply say the end, right? The time of the end. John Goldingay then on page 429 of his commentary, the Word Biblical Commentary, simply says this: "This is not the absolute eschatological end. This is the end of an era, of an event, of a time period." And the reason why we need to think about that is because although we will find a type of the Antichrist here in Daniel 8, what we're actually looking at in Daniel 8 is a vision fulfilled. It's a vision that has already been completed. And from Daniel's perspective, it's still hundreds of years in the future. And from our perspective, this has been over for thousands of years. Okay? So we need to kind of get that time difference settled in our minds. All right? The time of the end means the end of an empire, the end of an event, the end of an era. All right? So now, let's pause the video. What questions or comments or further insight do you have? Share with one another. If you wish to hear from me on a question, make sure to either write it down or text me, and that way I'll know to include it in the next video. So further comments or insights that you may have. Let's pause at this time. All right, thank you so much. So let's then continue into verse 18, and let's have maybe one person read verses 18 through 22, and a second person read for us verses 23 through 26. So the first person, Daniel 8, chapter 8, verses 18 through 22, and the second person, verses 23 through 26 for us, please. Let's pause the video at this time. Thank you so very much for reading, everyone. We appreciate that. Let's start to take a look here. When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. This is interesting. Deep sleep with my face to the ground. Daniel's already in a vision, and yet he falls asleep, but he's somehow also going to be aware of what's going on. And so we kind of have to think about this. He's going to be aware of the touch on his shoulder or the touch on his back, and he's going to be aware of the voice that comes. So he falls on a deep sleep, probably out of fear, maybe for some other reason. Maybe this is a euphemism for dying, so to speak. It doesn't seem that way in the New Testament. When Paul talks about those who have fallen asleep, it's actually an idiom for saying that somebody's dead. Here it does not seem to mean that. It simply means fell into a deep sleep, his face to the ground. Okay. Gabriel touches him, makes him stand up. Verse 19. You know what? I've not been doing this this time, and so let's pause the video here again in verse 19 and ask you, what are some things that you see in the text from verses 19 through 26? And why don't you share those with one another? Just insights that you see. Especially try to keep it close to the text. So say, like, I see this in verse 20, or I see this in verse 21. Maybe draw some insights or comments that you may have, or maybe some questions that you may have. So why don't you all talk about verses 19 through 26 for a few minutes, and just draw out some insights from the text. Let's pause the video at this time. All right. Thank you so very much for talking about it. Now I just want to point out some different features of the text for us here. It says, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation," for it refers to the appointed time of the end. So one of the things then that you see is the indignation there. So something is going to be deeply troubling for the people of God and even for God. The indignation then is really going to be what happens to the temple. Now remember, when Daniel's having this vision, the temple has not been rebuilt. But what they're going to be drawing upon throughout the rest of Daniel is really the desecration that happens to the temple in the midst of the Greek Empire. And so we'll get to that, but that's really what the indignation is about. Look at this, verse 20. "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia." So this is one of the reasons why we say, hey, this part of the vision, at least, although there might be some types of things to come, or have also been fulfilled, is right here in the interpretation. Gabriel's giving us what the ram means, and it's historic empire, the kings of Media and Persia. Now, Media and Persia kind of just merge into Persia, but you also have this time of sometimes they're separated out. So let's take a look at the Persian Empire and see what we have. This is a depiction of the conquests that have happened. And so you see Persia's down here. Cyrus wins some victories. He goes over and basically conquers the Medes. Then he comes in and conquers Babylonia. Then he conquers the old Assyrian Empire. Take a look here. This is Nineveh. All right. So he comes over here. He's also going to go up. He's going to capture Sardis. All right. This is way up in... it says Lydia here. This is going to be modern day Turkey, I believe. But it's up here in Lydia. He's also, with conquering of Babylon here, he's also going to basically extend and conquer all of this territory here down into the Promised Land, down further, all the way, closing in on Sinai and Egypt, right? So this is just a massive empire. The Persian Empire has the known world under their thumb and under their power. And this is why then in the vision you see the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him. There's no one to rescue him from his power. He became great. Okay. Now, it probably then makes sense for the relocation of the capital. It's from here to the fortress Susa, really, over time, in the Persian Empire. And that's more central, and you have that nice river there going in to sustain the population. Okay, so it's a much nicer place. But so you have the Persian Empire, and you just see how mighty and expansive it is. This is a huge, huge ancient empire. So as for the ram that you saw, we went over that in verse 20. 21, the goat is the king of Greece. All right, the goat's the king of Greece. Now remember that there's some immersiveness, there's some merging of kings and kingdoms, of kings and empires. A king is not a king without a kingdom, and there is no kingdom without a king, right? Or there's no queendom without a queen, right? So the sense here of the goat being the king of Greece, don't get too bent over that, that has to be just one king. No, the goat's going to actually stand for the Greece Empire, the Greek Empire, all right? But it's also the king of Greece. The great horn between his eyes is the first king, right? So there we go. The goat is the kingdom of Greece. The great horn between his eyes is the first king. I still imagine that almost like a unicorn. You have that huge horn. Maybe there's 3 horns on that one. But the first horn is the king. So let's take a look then at the Greece Empire. We're going to start way over here, actually, in what's labeled Macedonia. This is modern day Greece. Okay, and this is where the Greece Empire would have started from. This is where the Greece Empire started from, and they're going to conquer specifically under Alexander the Great. And if I were to zoom in on the atlas, and if you were able to see the text, it would simply say Alexander wins battle, Alexander wins battle, Alexander captures, Alexander secures, Alexander visits, Alexander, actually it's Alexander army here, Alexander dies over here and somewhere near Babylon apparently. But under Alexander the Great, he's a mastermind, and they just rip roar. I mean, they just battle and conquer all the Persian Empire. Right down here is going to be Persia. Okay, here's the Persian citadel of Susa. Here's Babylon, and conquers way the whole Persian Empire down into India is where their army goes. I mean, Alexander just conquers so much so quickly, and it's the Greece Empire, right? This is the Hellenistic Empire, just massive territory, very, very quickly. And we don't have to go into the reasons for that. It's enough for the vision to say, hey, this happened. And so when we come back and we see, if we were to go up again into, for example, verse 5 and 6, he came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. And he ran at him in his powerful wrath, closed in on the ram, was enraged, struck the ram, broke both of his horns. The ram had no power against him. The goat became exceedingly great. Okay, so that's the idea. The Greece Empire came in and just began to conquer. Okay. As for the horn that was broken, right? So again, we're backing up into verse 8. But when it was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. I am sorry. It's getting near my bedtime here when I'm recording. So there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. That's again in verse 8. And so here in verse 22, we're receiving it, and says, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. Right, so basically what they're going to talk about is that the Greece Empire will be fractured into 4 different parts, into 4 different regions, really. It's going to be geographical in nature. And none of them are going to have the same power as Alexander the Great. So the 4 kingdoms arise from his nation without his power. And some of those sections then are going to war against one another. And so we have an interesting situation that we're not going to go into at the moment. Fortunately, I didn't find a really good looking map to show you. Usually most of my atlases are just focused on the promised land, and so I don't have a picture of the 4 different kingdoms. Needless to say, basically there are 2 kingdoms that will battle in the Greek Empire. There are 2 kingdoms that will battle each other for the promised land, and eventually a figure named Antiochus IV is going to come out as a ruler of the promised land of Judah, which is where we get in verse 23, and at the latter end of their kingdom. Right, so it's talking about the 4 Greek kingdoms, and towards the end of that time, under Antiochus IV, the Romans are just starting to begin to make some waves over in Italy, right? So they're just starting kind of up at that point, and so we kind of have that sort of lurking in the background here. So it's at the latter end of their kingdom. When the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. And I want to talk because I'm pretty certain that's going to be Antiochus IV, and indeed Joyce Baldwin says this is going to be around 175 BC. Antiochus IV begins his reign. In 169 BC, Antiochus enters the temple. Okay, so to have a Gentile enter into the second temple is like anathema, right? I mean, that just desecrates the whole place. Antiochus has two key aspects to him, John Goldingay writes. He is ruthless boldness and his artful cleverness, right? So that's how Goldingay describes Antiochus and matches it kind of with what's in the text. A king of bold face, meaning ruthless boldness. One who understands riddles means artful cleverness, right? One who understands riddles in the text. Riddles here, when we're thinking about riddles does not necessarily mean that he's excellent at solving verbal puzzles, right? I mean, he could be, but what it's really pointing to is cleverness, because those who are able to understand and solve riddles are those who are clever. And so it's cleverness, it's an ability to see into mysteries, that sort of thing. And so he's a clever king, which shouldn't surprise us. And I want to read another section here. We didn't cover this last week, but this is another comment from John Goldingay a little bit earlier on page 420. He says this, in context, this is a small horn. Growing is Antiochus IV. Okay, and again, where I'm getting that from is, remember in verse 9, it says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great. And what we're looking at here then in verse 23, the latter end of the kingdom, when the transgressors have reached the limit, a king of bold face will come about. Well, that's the small horn from verse 9. All right, so we want to kind of connect those different dots. Let's simply pause here for a moment and ask, what questions or comments or insights do you have so far? Right. Well, thank you so very much. Let's take a look then further on. Verse 25. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken. Okay, and so we're down here. But by no human hand, which means this, that God is the one who will strike down Antiochus IV. It's not going to be by assassination. It may be by something that we call a normal cause, but in the end, what it's going to be is it's going to be by God's hand that he is struck down. And so that's where we're going. Rise up against the Prince of Princes. Again, that's like rising up against Jesus, rising up against God, the second person of the Trinity. He does that by entering the temple, by establishing new times and festivals and that sort of thing that we've talked about again in Daniel chapter 7. So we have that sort of thing happening. All right. Now, here's then the thing. Again, Antiochus IV is a type of the Antichrist, right? So when we're thinking about the Antichrist in the New Testament, this idea of being cunning, making deceit prosper under his hand, is also things that we would pull out of like 2 Thessalonians when he's talking about the Antichrist, right? Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan. Remember, Satan's the father of lies, deception. With all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing. Right? And you can almost see that the matching up here with it. Shall make deceit prosper under his hand. Right? And the Antichrist is going to be doing the same, making deceit prosper, so to speak. Again, rising up and destroy many. That could also be a description of what happens in Revelation with the destruction of the saints, with the persecution of those under the rule and reign of God. So again, we under the reign and rule of God. Under the reign and rule of God. And so we have those kind of things going on. Daniel 8, again, we want to focus in. This is historical, but it provides a type. It's like a prophecy in action of something that is also to come. Verse 26, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up for the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Remember, that's not many days from our now. It's many days from Daniel's now. Okay, and several hundred years passed from when Daniel was receiving the vision in, 550-ish BC, give or take a few decades there, because I'm going off the top of my head. Around 550 BC, all the way, really, these events are happening in 172 BC, right? So it's several hundred years down the line that God is giving Daniel insight into. And it's all happening in haste, right? Hundreds of years are compressed into a few lines. The Persian Empire didn't go away overnight. Greece did not rise overnight, and their empire didn't start flagging overnight, right? But in the vision, the time is compressed down to simply a few verses, right? The great horn cracks, there's then 4, and then all of a sudden we're into this little horn that comes up. Although that's a good chunk of that's several hundred years between those few events, between the division of the 4 empires and suddenly Antiochus IV coming on the scene. And so we also have to understand that the time in this vision is not working the same way we would maybe conceptualize of the time. Some parts are drawn out, some parts are crunched together, and here we have hundreds of years crunched together very quickly. Okay. The vision of the evenings and the mornings is really about the time frame, 2,300 days, really with the temple being desecrated and being that restored and all the events therein. Seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Okay, we just mentioned that. Very good. We're then on to our last verse, so let's try to go ahead and get it in. I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Here's something that we just need to understand, I think, with visions. And again, it comes about so that we have greater clarity. When somebody is receiving a vision from God, it can be of such a nature that it's actually appalling to the person. They don't understand it. It's scary. It's overcome. Daniel, because he receives this vision, lays sick for some days. Right? This is a testimony not only to its truthfulness, but also like kind of an expectation. Like sometimes we see people going and especially this happens in the charismatic movement, right? There's all of a sudden people getting visions, and they're having visions and then able to go on the air in the next 10 minutes or next hour or the next day or whatever the case might be. And here what we see is actually the consequence of being close to God and receiving such a vision is that they lay sick for some days. Okay, and at least in Daniel's case, that's what happened. All right, so that brings us to the end of Daniel chapter 8. Next week, we'll try to begin in Daniel chapter 9. At this time of the video, let's turn off the video so we can shut off the video because I'm done. And let's simply talk with one another. You can engage with questions or comments, come up with some questions for me, and just talk with one another about Daniel 8. Again, if it's 10:20, we'll probably want to begin to head upstairs. If it's 10:20, we'll head upstairs. All right, thank you so very much, everybody. God bless.